Welcome back to Dano Does Things. My name is Dano and thank you very much for checking out this video. This video is part 2 of a 3-part fall elf costume series that I am doing. Last week I made myself a cloak. If you haven't seen that video yet, please check it out in the description box below. And next week I will be making a felt crown. This week I'm going to be making a dress. Now, I have a pattern that I found at the thrift store that I think is going to work, but I'm going to try to modify it a bit to fit more into that sort of elf vibe that I'm looking for. I have modified patterns in the past to some success, so hopefully this goes well. I'm a very amateur sewer, so if you're thinking that you've wanted to modify patterns, perhaps this will inspire you. I guess we'll see how it turns out first, if it inspires you or not, but... Last week's video was a bit longer than the videos I usually make, so I'm gonna stop talking. We're just gonna get right into making this dress. Here is the pattern I will be using. Not very elfy right now, but with some modifications it should suit our needs. On the back of the original pattern there is a zipper and 2 pleats with a belt loop. The front is sewn up and also has the 2 pleats with belt loops. To modify it, I'm going to not put the zipper on the back and just sew straight up the seam fully together. I'll keep the pleats but not use the belt loops. The front I will leave open, finishing the front seam and then adding grommets so that I can lace up the front. Again, I'll keep the pleats but not the belt loops. I have these 11-inch grommets to use on the front, which are a bit bigger than I wanted, but all I could find in this color. I also have about 3 yards of this dark green cotton and some thread to match. The first step is to lay out the fabric and place the pattern pieces following the pattern instructions. Even though I cut out the facing, I didn't end up using it. More on that later. I cut out the pieces, adding a few inches on the front piece because I wasn't sure yet how I was going to reinforce the grommet edge, and I wanted some fabric to work with just in case. Once everything was cut out and all the pattern markers were transferred, I started by putting in the 4 pleats, one for each of the front panels and each of the back panels. For this I had to sew along the lines from the pattern, so I used pins to make sure they were lined up before pinning it down. Once all 4 were pinned, I sewed along the line, making sure to backstitch at both ends. After they were all sewed, I pressed down the pleat, pushing down the section so it was even on both sides. Next I pinned the 2 back pieces together with right sides touching and sewed all the way along the edge with a straight stitch about 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge. I then finished the seam with a top stitch, which consists of trimming one of the seams in half, then folding the wider seam over and under and pressing. Then I sewed a straight stitch close to the edge from the inside of the garment. This creates a nice, neat inside seam with an interesting outer seam detail. I then pinned together the shoulder seams and the side seams using the pattern markers to line them up and sewed up all 4 seams with the same straight stitch with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I am testing the dress for fit now that I have these shoulder seams and the side seams and the back seam all done. It is quite big, so I'm gonna have to make a few adjustments. I've already pinned the back in about an inch, so I'm gonna go in through and do that. And I find that the shoulders are a bit gappy as well, sort of back here. So I'm gonna bring those up and pin those up as well, take a little bit of space out of there. I think I'm going to as well bring in the side seams just a little at the waist. It's like a straight seam from the armpit to the ground, and I want a bit more definition there. The front part is going to be changed so that I have the grommets on the front, but that might bring the tucks a little too close. So I'm gonna pin out that fold and just see sort of where the tucks are laying once I've got the side seams and the back seams all done. So let's go do some alterations. Once the first fitting was complete, I had to rip out basically all my seams. Before I did that, I traced out my pinned in alterations with chalk and then followed that to sew up my altered seams. All right, so I have made a bunch of adjustments. I haven't clipped any of the seams yet, but you can see I took in quite a bit at the sides here, as well as in the shoulders and in the back, and now it's definitely giving me more of that sort of shape I was looking for, as opposed to the original pattern. And now this isn't quite touching anymore, but that's fine because we're gonna have this come in and be laced up the front, and we wanna be able to see some of that shift dress underneath. Now I'm a little concerned because I made so many modifications that the facing is going to be all wonky now, but I guess we'll just have to figure that out tomorrow. But yeah, I think it's going good so far. With the second fitting done, I trimmed down the new seams and then called it a night. In the morning, I consulted my favorite sewing book, which I look at multiple times when I sew, as it has tons of information about basic and not so basic sewing techniques, and I decided to switch from a facing to use a double fold bias tape to invisibly finish the edges. And that, of course, involved creating some bias tape. Since it'll be invisible, I just grabbed some scrap fabric and started by cutting out 1-inch strips at a 45-degree angle to the selvage. To create long bias strips, I then lined up the strips at a 90-degree angle with the angled edges lined up. Then I sewed along the angle and trimmed and pressed the excess. Then I pressed the bias tape into shape. First I folded it in half and pressed, and then brought each edge into the center and pressed again. I then had what turned out to be way more bias tape than I needed and tried the dress on again to adjust the front opening before I finished it. Okay, the next step is just figuring out how wide I want this opening in the front here. I want it to, the grommets are going to go on either side and then have the ties crisscrossing here, so I want there to be some white in the middle there, so I think that's going to be good. I don't want too much. Yeah, I think that's going to be good. So I'm going to reinforce this seam here with muslin so that when the grommet goes through, it doesn't just rip through. I am going to do some practice grommets. I have enough for that, so, but that should be enough. Then after that, it's just finishing the edges with that bias tape, and then we should be done. I attached the bias tape all along the front edge by unfolding the bias tape and pinning it right side to right side. I then sewed all along the edge with a straight stitch, following the first crease line on the bias tape. The tape is then folded over so that all the edges are tucked under, and the bias tape is now on the wrong side of the garment. I pressed that all the way around. Before I sewed that down, I needed to figure out the whole grommet situation, so I first tested the grommet on a piece of the facing that I didn't end up using, with some muslin interfacing attached to it for strength. I marked the inside of the grommet and then cut out the hole just inside the ring. I really wish I had an awl for this, but maybe one day. Once I got the hole the right size so that the grommet just barely fits into it, I grabbed a hard surface for hammering. Then, to attach the grommet, I put down the grommet disc first, then the fabric with the grommet front placed through it with the right side of the fabric down. Then comes the back of the grommet and the grommet closing tool. Finally, I gave that whole stack a nice tap with the old hammer. Everything worked well, so I went back to my dress. While I had the dress on, I had marked where the top and bottom grommets should go. I took that measurement and made these plackets, which is just muslin with fabric sewed to it. And I brought the fabric around both short edges and on one long edge. The non-bound edge of the placket will be tucked into the bias tape and then sewn down with it. Then I have a nice little reinforced section on which to place my grommets. I then sewed all the way around the front edge, sewing down the bias tape, and I finished the armholes with the same bias tape technique. Finally, it was time to attach the grommets to the actual garment. All that was left was to do a simple double-folded hem, and the dress was ready. And that is it, the completed dress. I'm really happy with how this turned out, especially considering this week I was super busy, and so I didn't really have as much time as I probably should have to work on this. But that's okay. It's also why I'm filming in my house right now, because it is pitch black and raining outside, and I just had to get this done. But next week, after I finish the felt crown, I'll be able to fully style this outfit, wear my cloak and my dress and my crown, and take some really nice videos and pictures, fingers crossed. I'm happy with how the grommets turned out, even though they were a bit bigger than I wanted them to. The plackets worked really well to hold in the grommets. That way I only have a little extra bulk right where the grommets are, and the rest of it can still be swishy and form-fitting and not bulky. I'm also happy for that same reason that I went with the bias binding instead of the facing, just to reduce a lot of the bulk around the neckline. I also kind of accidentally gave it a sort of raised neckline, which was a complete accident, but I kind of like it. It's kind of cute. So, all right, I have to go edit this video, so I'll leave it there for now. Please check out last week's cloak video if you haven't yet. Give this video a thumbs up if you are enjoying the series, and stay tuned for next week's felt crown finale video. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.